Thanks to the presence of the German consul, we have been able to keep this conference right on schedule. So, so we have been very successful in doing that. So I think at lunch, after our lunch, we'll come back here. We will have a very ample question and answer session with the speakers. And then we will hear from Ambassador Tom Pickering, who's already here. I think he's outside. Tom goes, correct. He goes before the Q&A, and then we have the Q&A. And then I think we should be able to leave a lot sooner than we had anticipated on the schedule. So I think we'll be doing very well on timing. Tom is probably outside. I heard he had to take a call on Russia. And I wondered, doesn't he realize that Cuba is more important? But that's all right. He'll figure that out. All right. Now we're going to hear from Dr. Solis-Silva, who is going to sort of bring all of this into perspective, into our own perspective, with our own complexities, peculiarities, and so forth. And he's going to weave through this process of concepts that we have been learning from the beginning, the first conference, reconciliation, forgiveness. Today we learned from Donna that there is an alternative to forgiveness that perhaps gets us to the same place, the future as that which will unite us, as opposed to the past, which will divide us. And Dr. Solis is going to weave all of that in and talk about the importance of dialogue in a political culture, not only to satisfy the needs of Cuba today, but also to be with us for the Cuba of the future. So, Dr. Solis, thank you.
That's a lot of weaving. So, first of all, let me thank the Cuba Study Group and Carlos for inviting me to share these few reflections on these issues. I'll be honest with you, my first reaction when I was first invited, was one of mild surprise. And then that mild surprise grew and grew and grew as I learned the identity of the other two members of the panel, Mr. Suroy, who's, as you just heard, a man of tremendous experience and accomplishments on the question of reconciliation, and Professor Higgs, who has written an insightful and profound book on the issue of dignity. So I saw that really, I was then really surprised and humbled. And actually, my contribution to this conversation has to be very humble. The only value it will have will be that of sincerity, and that it is an expression of my desire to collaborate with what I think is a wonderful project that Carlos is heading and is promoting with the Cuba Study Group and other things. So I again, thank you very much. And I want to use a word that Professor Higgs used, the word empathy. And I'm going to want to use it in a very selfish way, because I want to ask you to feel empathy for me. It's a difficult task that I have, and I will try to do my best. In thinking about reconciliation and dignity, basically those two notions were the first ones that I was dealing with. Something else came to mind. And indeed, Professor Higgs talked about false dignity. And that, I think, is a very good point there she makes. When I was thinking about the issue of dignity and reconciliation, the word that came to me, the notion that came to me in terms of how do we avoid false dignity and actually encounter dignity, is the word humility. And so if you look at the title of my presentation, is Humility, Dignity, Reconciliation, and the Cuban Context. Humility is what I will add maybe a little bit to the mix. As I was thinking about this, I kept thinking about that issue of dignity. How do we encounter dignity? As Professor Higgs pointed, dignity pertains to our humanity, to the personhood, to our personhood. Does not emerge from anything we do or anything we procure or accomplish. It's in our humanity, in our very personhood. But how do we find that? Because one thing is having it, one thing is knowing intellectually, being able to define it, and another thing is experiencing. And my point is, unless you experience your own dignity, you cannot recognize the dignity of the other. If you cannot experience your own dignity, what we have then afterwards is an exchange of vanity and pride. Our vanity is hurt, our pride is hurt, but and maybe that of the other. But we have to encounter human dignity, our own human dignity, and that is only through humility. It sounds vague, but it is vague. In thinking, how do I clarify this point? I thought of a film that I saw many years ago. Maybe some of you have seen it. Maybe the younger ones have not. The Elephant Man. How many people have seen The Elephant Man? Yeah. Great, good. I see the young man over there hasn't seen it because it's but in The Elephant Man there is a scene that I think is very much to the point here. You remember The Elephant Man is a story of this Englishman, Joseph Merrick, who is born with a disease that causes deformities in his head, his face, other parts of his body. By the time he gets to be an adult, he has an appearance, it's almost a freakish appearance. And so it's very difficult. He cannot earn a living. He has sometimes lived off freak shows that hire him for. So it's a pathetic existence in a certain sense. And the scene that I'm remembering is one time when Joseph, when he goes outside among people, he wears a huge hat and a veil that covers his entire face to hide the deformities, to hide the ugliness that tends to frighten people. Now he's outside in this particular scene. So this, just those of you who saw the film, try to remember. Those of you who didn't, just walk with me in this. This man, a big man with this huge hat and the veil, is walking in the streets. And all of a sudden, a strong wind knocks his hat off and his veil is removed. And there he is in the middle of a crowd, in the middle of a public space, in his ugliness and his freakish appearance. And a mob begins to gather around him. An aggressive mob begin to taunt him because they feel they're frightened by him. And so fearing for his life, he begins to flee. He begins to run away. And the mob pursues him, goes after him, taunting him, shouting, screaming, and trying to grab him. And in desperation, he walks inside a lavatory to hide, seek protection. They follow him in there. The crowd follows him in there. And at the last moment, he's lying down on the ground, on the floor. And at the last moment, there's no place to go, has no escape, no place else to hide. All of a sudden, he sort of stands up and with a dramatic voice says, I am a human being. I am a human being, in a very dramatic way. Now that voice resounds and paralyzes everyone, brings the action to a halt. Actually, what has happened there is Joseph has at that point encountered his dignity, encounters his humanity. And the funny part of it is that by screaming it, exclaiming it that way, he has also brought the crowd back into themselves, into their dignity. All of a sudden, the mob breaks back down into individual persons who all of a sudden recognize the nature of the situation, what they have been doing, and everything stops. And I think it's very important just to zero in a little bit on what has happened here, to draw some conclusions. Notice what's happened. Joseph Merrick has been used all his life to hide his humanity himself in terms of his deformities and his ugliness, with veils and hats and stuff to cover it up. And all of a sudden, the situation is such, the persecution, when he's driven to a position in which he must make a choice. He must choose. And here comes in a word, and a bore using technical words and be complicated, like to use, so, but forgive me, and I'll try to be as, he finds what we can define as his ontological, his existential freedom. That's what it is. He now is facing, he's now in a situation where he becomes aware of his freedom. The freedom to do either one or two things. Cower, reject his humanity, curse it. Maybe just lie there whimpering like an animal, or fighting back like a cat, like a wild cat would, with physical violence. He doesn't do either. What he is doing, what Joseph Merrick does, is actually to take away from the mob their ability to humiliate him. How does he do that? He does that by stepping freely into his humility. He steps into the recognition that we as human beings are vulnerable. Actually, that our very being is filled with indigence. Indigence. The hat, the veil, cover that up for him. Covers it up for each one of us. Each one of us, we have hats and we have veils. I have academic titles. Other people have enterprises, money, fame, beauty. All those are veils. Simone Weil once remarked that the difference between the beautiful woman and a homely woman was very simple. The beautiful woman, when she looks into a mirror, she thinks that's her. The homely woman, when she looks into the mirror, she knows that's not her. What has happened, what happens there is the encounter. It is easier to be deceived. The beautiful woman there, Simone Weil pointing out to us, is deceived by the image, by the externals, and fails to see her true self. The homely woman is not deceived by their beauty. She is forced to look inside, and then she must either accept it or reject it. If she rejects it, she will lead a life of lies, of lying to herself and lying to others, putting on tons of cosmetic and stuff. But whereas if she accepts it, she begins to encounter her human dignity. That's real human dignity. And the price to encounter it is humility. Humility. I call that fundamental humility, to distinguish it from something else that I'm going to talk about after, which is intellectual humility. But now it's just fundamental humility that allows me to encounter my dignity, not my vanity, not my pride. Actually, vanity and pride, sometimes accomplishments, whether they be academic, financial, whatever, tend to be obstacles sometimes. Tend to be obstacles sometimes to hide ourselves. It's something, dealing with this, and I apologize, I don't mean to bring religion into this, but it's just that for the first time I understood what was the meaning of the blessedness, of the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor, blessed are the poor, blessed are the, how can they be blessed? Poverty in itself is not good. Or none of the other stuff. The Beatitudes I began to understand what he's getting at. Well, blessed because they are being offered the chance of encountering the most important thing, their dignity. Their dignity. That dignity. You could say, blessed are those who find their dignity. Blessed are those who find their dignity. And now, this is the point of departure, that dignity. It's the point of departure because Merrick, there in the floor, or in that lavatory, not only found his dignity, but was able to allow others to find that dignity and to realize the dignity of those others that surrounded him. That's shared. You say, well, how is that possible? Why? We can say all kinds of things, but actually, why? Why would my dignity have anything to do with yours? Because we share a common humanity. It's interesting. The 20th century has done a lot of work on language. the importance and centrality of language. Well, language, if nothing else, language will give us a key, a clue to our social nature. Language is like the tango. Remember the tango? It takes two to tango. Well, language always takes two. What comes first? Human beings or language? It's like the chicken and the egg. It's a false question because they're inseparable. It's a radical, inherent mutual relationship. It is that we as human beings do not choose to be in society. It's not something we choose with all due respect to John Locke. Society is not something that we simply arbitrarily choose to be in. It's something we are born in. Our humanity is a universal value that we share. There's no way of escaping that. And ultimately, all senses of justice, and I think all democracy is based on that possibility. The discovery of our own humility that allows us to discover, our own dignity that allows us to discover and to affirm the dignity of the other with one very simple fact. Don't hurt, don't infringe upon the other's dignity, because ultimately you are infringing it upon yourself. Those who do not respect the dignities of others are not respecting their own. What is it? The question becomes, what is it that dignity, that dignity that we recognize in the other and in ourselves, what claim does it put on us? What does it require from us? Very straightforward. It requires that we treat the other well, that we treat the other as we wish him or her to treat us. That mutual element. Some may say, you mean to say that we need to treat others well, to treat them well, no matter what they do, no matter what their history is? Well, actually, what they do on their history is part of the veil and the hat, because it has nothing to do with their humanity, ultimately. It is their humanity that places the claim on us to treat them with respect. Respect not in the sense that Professor Hicks is very right in what she said concerning respect, but respect in the sense of what dignity requires, consideration, regard for that dignity. It has nothing to do with personal actions. It doesn't mean that we condone those actions, that we share in those actions. No. It simply means making a very fine distinction. We recognize them as human beings, as persons, and therefore we owe them that treatment. I would go as far as saying that it requires, ultimately, Plato argued for that. Kant argues for that too. Of course, the gospel argues for that. That to return evil with good. It also sounds, some people say, but if we do that, then justice is not done. Because justice requires that we punish the evildoer, that somehow there be retribution. When we insist on that, is that we are actually holding justice to be strictly retribution. And we understand retribution as an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And that, if we apply it that way, that's not justice. And what it does, it leads us into a community of toothless and blind people. Actually, justice has to always keep the relationship with the good. The good, not in the sense of the utilitarian good. John Rawls, last century, actually did a wonderful explanation, analysis of the good. It's not the good in the utilitarian sense. It's that kind of good that doesn't leave anyone behind. That common good that doesn't leave anyone behind. But to do justice that really is justice and therefore maintains and keeps that relationship to the good, it requires that it be lifted up above retribution, above that. That be lifted up by something that I think both Professor Hicks and Mr. Soroy mentioned. Generosity. generosity, that freedom that Joseph Merrick exercised, that existential freedom, from there arises the possibility of generosity. And when we use generosity to lift justice above retribution, then we have a broad horizon. Now we are talking. Now, as they used to say in America a long, long time ago, now we are cooking with gas. Now but we can't just stop there. We have touched upon the relationship of humility, freedom, dignity, and how dignity makes claims upon us, claims to treat the other always well, to return good for evil. That's the possibility of forgiveness. And indeed, forgiveness, as Professor said, forgiveness does not imply forgetting. I don't forget. Because to forget, if we were to forget, it would make it impossible for us to truly forgive. The holding to the events, not forgetting them, is what allows that moment of generosity to forgive. Now, having said this, we said that the discovery of dignity requires from us that treating them well, regarding them with those considerations. But what else does that imply? It implies the realization that he or she has something to say. And now comes in the second notion of humility that I wanted to bring to you for your attention. Intellectual humility. Intellectual humility. What is that? Well, it's the realization that no one has access, no human being, no person has access to the whole truth. To the whole truth. No person has direct, complete access. No one has privileged access to the truth so that he can see it and grasp it all and have it all. Now, the 20th century has told us that we can go down the list. Wittgenstein, Gadamer, Jürgen Habermas, Richard Rohr. We could go, I don't want to do that. It would be pedantic to bring all, it's name dropping at its worst. It's not that, but it's just a claim, indeed the realization that we as persons, as human beings, like Joseph Merrick, every one of us, I love, we had the presentation, that little picture of the baby that Professor Hicks showed us, that beautiful baby. We all began like that, maybe not as beautiful, but we all begin as that baby. And we are drawn into the world by a community, a language community, a love community, family, mother, father. We're slowly invited into reality, into the world. Our entrance into the world, our connection with reality, with being, when we use technical terms, is through language. Through language. To the point that I would dare say, no language, no person. No person, no language. It's inextricably. So when we talk, when we understand something, when we say something claiming to some sort of truth, some sort of knowledge, we do it always with a proviso, with that we are doing it from within a certain perspective, from within certain limitations. And this is something that the 19th century forgot this. Ideologies, the creation of isms in the 19th century gave us a legacy in the 20th century, a legacy of blood and murder. All those isms. The legacy of the Holocaust, of the terrible killings by Stalin, by Mao, and you could go on and on and on, done in the name of isms. Well, in the 20th century, we have learned to move beyond that, to realize that no one, that ideology is a sickness, is an illness, because no one has absolute access to truth. Regrettably, postmodernity has replaced some of these excesses by modernity. with its own excesses. Fundamentalism, extreme nationalism, all these are. But you see, non-fundamentalist religions, even non-fundamentalist religions are not fundamentalists, but that have a history of expressing themselves dogmatically, have recognized that this is not possible, that is wrong. Pope John the 23rd, when the Roman Catholic Church held the Vatican Council in the early 60s, it had 2 sessions. And there was a pause between the 2 sessions. And in between, Pope John the 23rd granted an interview, a press conference to the international press. And some American journalists asked him, well, Your Holiness, we hear all these changes. Is it that the gospel has changed? They said, no, the gospel has not changed. But we have come to understand it better and better and better. The change happens in our understanding. And thereby he was recognizing, indeed, that understanding is a historical event and therefore conditioned, therefore limited. All we have to, this new pope that we have, the same thing. That the editor of La Repubblica asked him the question, do you believe you have absolute truth? And he said, I won't answer that question because it will hook me, it will suck me into a false dilemma between relativism and absolute. Because it's false. All I can answer is by pointing you to the gospel itself. Jesus says, I am the life, the truth, and the way. Therefore, equating truth with life and with way, with the road. All truth is always limited, it's always partial. Intellectual humility, which is that second aspect of humility, is our coming to realize that and accepting it. And by accepting it, realizing precisely, accepting that the other person has something to say, that the other person completes me, complements me, and therefore is not simply an issue, it's not a strategy, dialogue, which is that realization. Dialogue is the realization that the other has something to say and that my knowledge, my understanding of the truth is not absolute. Dialogue, therefore, the result of humility, of intellectual humility, if it happened, dialogue is not a strategy. It's not a political strategy. I will give this same talk. Actually, I do give this same talk to my students with no political connotations. It's nothing to do with politics. It has political repercussions, but it's not a political thing. It's not a strategy. Dialogue is our way of being in the world. It's our very mode of being human. Just the same way that recognition of the dignity of the other is essential. Recognition of dialogue is essential, of the fact that the other has something to say. If I don't do that recognition, then I am really not consistent in recognizing the other's dignity. As I said, it does not mean that I condone, that I agree, none of that. It simply implies that I recognize the dignity of the other, my own dignity, and my limitations intellectually, and how precisely I need the other just to be able to access the truth. I access it through the other. Dialogue, again, I want to repeat, is not a strategy. Requires this humility and requires courage. The courage to actually enter into a process of which I know the point of departure, the starting point, but I don't know the end. It's a risk. If we're not prepared to take risks, we already have the seeds of dictatorship, the seeds of absolutism. Because the seed of democracy is planted, grows in that acknowledgement and in the risk when we live in democracy, we run the risk that the majority will be in disagreement with me. That's a risk I take. And that I will accept that. The Bill of Rights precisely creates limits as to what a majority can do, respect for the minority, which is what's really the essence of democracy. It guarantees that even if many people agree on the same thing, that minority that doesn't agree has something to say. And we must continue in dialogue with that minority. So you have there the two aspects of humility, the two aspects of humility. And now, I want to bring it, is everybody with me here? Does everybody get the two elements there? The two, yeah. I'm very insecure about this.
You were very clear.
I want to do something. I want to depart from what I've been doing. Let me just clarify something, because, and I'm going to read it. It should be noted that we are not denying that violence is sometimes thrust upon people, and that self-defense is a right that sometimes justifies violence. That's undeniable. Nevertheless, this should only be so when all other means have truly been exhausted. Truly been exhausted. And there remain no alternatives. And even then, violence in response to violence should be limited, proportionate, and always free of hatred. Free of hatred. We should realize that even though such occasions do justify our recourse to violence, they do not always really lead to long-term permanent solutions or to peace. Very seldom, if ever, can peace be achieved through violence. Now, as I need to depart from what I've been doing in the sense that I want to read. It's just very short, and with that I will finish. As we bring it into the Cuban context, into the context of our shared Cuban experience. And I thank Mr. Suroy for his mention of Alejo Carpentier and his very delicate words, showing precisely tremendous intellectual humility in terms of the application of his experiences to the Cuban situation. I'm sorry. Yeah. Now we begin to be in a position to turn our attention to the understanding of reconciliation. Now that we have dignity, dialogue, firmly grounded in our humility, and there are no magic wands, as Professor Hicks says, no magic tricks, no magic formulas for that. It takes humility. Now we begin to be in a position to turn our attention to the understanding of reconciliation. Reconciliation begins to be possible when we are ready to regard the other with dignity. That is the point of departure for the process of reconciliation. We must now ask, what is the nature of this process? What does addressing the other with dignity entails and demands beyond her or him as we would want to be treated? Again, the issue of humility comes forward. And there I go, hold on, into intellectual humility. Now, I want to make a distinction, once we have talked about these two aspects of humility, the need for dialogue, for dignity. I want to distinguish between conciliation and reconciliation. Not the same thing. Not the same thing. If you look in the dictionary, I found one definition of conciliation that I found very useful. And I don't want to run the risk of mistaking here, watching it. It says, It is the state of manifesting reciprocal goodwill and cooperation. Reciprocal goodwill is the reciprocal recognition of dignity, cooperation, the ability and the disposition to dialogue. Conciliation is that. Conciliation is the state we could say that a society lives in conciliation when it lives in democracy. Reconciliation, on the other hand, is the process that is necessary in order to take us back to conciliation, to a state of conciliation. Everybody follows this with me. Now, you see, coming into let's bring some of this over into the Cuban context. I know that we are all tired. You have already been delighted by enjoying Mr. Soroy and Professor Hicks. I'm trying to shorten this as much as possible out of consideration. I should have been, they were the two main courses. I should have been the dessert. But all I am is a little Cuban coffee, and not too sweet at that. It says, in the 112 years that Cuba has existed as an independent nation state, it has lived in a state of conciliation, that is, the state of democracy, for only 32 years. I know some people get surprised. During the rest, 80 years, it has not lived in a state of conciliation or democracy. Coup d'etat, dictatorships, alzamientos are a recurring theme. From the very beginning, the conflict that was followed by the Second American Intervention in 1906, which lasted 3 years. La Chambelona, in the second decade after Cuban independence. El Machadato in the 1920s. The 7 years of Batista government from the Columbia barracks between 1933 and 1940. The 7 years of Batista dictatorship after the 20th March 1952. The 55 years of the present Cuban regime that deepened and dramatized the lack of conciliation and democracy between Cubans and created a chasm deep enough to separate us geographically. The Cubans in the insula and the Cubans in the peninsula. The waters of the Strait of Florida, these waters of the Strait of Florida have become a Cuban lake with Cubans living and working in its two shores. A symbolic and graphic reminder of the torn fabric of Cuban civic and political life. So symbolic. The deepening of our lack of conciliation is not new. In all 80 years of life in absence of a state of conciliation, of democracy, it is very important to keep this fact in mind so as not to narrow the focus of the process of reconciliation. Reconciliation has been a perennial necessity for Cuban society, and any current effort at reconciliation has to keep in mind that the issues that cause the wound, the break, the tear of the fabric of life living conciliation in democracy run deep in Cuban history and Cuban culture. If I may be allowed to use a less common term, the causes of the wound, the break, the collapse of a life living conciliation in democracy run deep in the Cuban meta-discourse. If we get culture, it's enough. Meta-discourse, culture. Each one of those episodes that string the history of Cuban civic and political life is an episode of violence. Each constitutes a breakdown of the process where fundamental humility and intellectual humility come together to allow us to live in the justice of reciprocally recognized dignity and in the truth of dialogue. The last of those episodes, the coming to power of the Castroite revolution, is almost like a magnification, a radicalization of the same pattern of breakdowns, of the interruption of the civic life of dialogue, and the appeal and recourse to violence. The last attempt at civic resolution, at dialogue, before the final explosion of revolution, was headed by Don Cosme de la Torriente. Maybe some of you don't remember Don Cosme de la Torriente in the 1950s, a few years before the triumph of the revolution. Don Cosme, as president of La Sociedad Amigos de la República, promoted and headed a civic dialogue to avoid the growing confrontation leading to the narrow dilemma of having to choose between dictatorship and revolution. Don Cosme advocated a compromise involving all elements, government and opposition to enter a concerted process of dialogue leading to general elections held with full guarantees. It is arguable that if Cubans had followed that route, and the tragedy that befell Cuba only a few years after might have been avoided. His appeal, Don Cosme's appeal, ultimately fell on deaf ears. Not only by the dishonest response of the government, but also by the response of the opposition and a great majority of the population that seemed at that point to distrust the process of dialogue and to be enthralled, enamored, as if we were being led by a siren song with the prospect of revolution. And indeed, they threw themselves headlong into that choice. What they understood by the term revolution is another matter that again lies buried in the intricacies of Cuban history. Nonetheless, whatever their version of the term revolution, it certainly implied violence instead of continued patient dialogue. This is something that, to me, is central to really understand the process of reconciliation. The choice for violence instead of a choice for continued, patient, long-term dialogue seems like a constant of Cuban history. We, Cubans, chose the cause of independence through violence, advocated by many patriots, rather than the cause of autonomy through prolonged, patient, continued dialogue advocated by many other patriots. I am not here questioning the rightness or wrongness of the choice, simply noting the fact. Our republic was ushered in through that choice. Our republic continued to make that same kind of choice throughout its history. And that choice comes back to us again and again and again. The present need for reconciliation is not absolutely new, nor does it begin with consequences of the current Cuban regime. It is not. Hugh Thomas, we all remember Hugh Thomas, in his monumental work on Cuban history, Cuba, the Pursuit of Freedom, writes, and I quote, "Perhaps even Cubans, for all their gifts, cannot escape Goethe's dictum, in vain will undisciplined spirits strive to achieve pure freedom. For the master first reveals itself in limitation, and only law can give us liberty." Pure freedom is a mirage, but freedom is not. It is possible only within a society governed by law, a basic law that has the assent of all those who are part of that society. Democracy, the state of conciliation, is such a society where fundamental humility and intellectual humility come together to allow us to live in the justice of reciprocally recognized dignity and in the truth of dialogue. Only there freedom is possible. It would now seem, in order to ask the question, why have Cubans made the choice of violence over dialogue? The causes run deep in Cuban history and Cuban culture. Even better, in the Cuban meta-discourses, as I said before. This is a fundamental question that needs to be asked. But as tempting as asking that question is, we must resist the temptation here. We don't have the time to do so here and now. What is imperative is that we conclude these remarks with a final brief discussion of reconciliation. Whatever has caused Cubans to choose violence over peace and dialogue, it is clear that the choice that we have repeatedly made has had terrible consequences for all Cubans. It's been our choice. The need for reconciliation is not absolutely new, nor does it begin with the consequences of the current Cuban regime. The need for reconciliation has been a constant need throughout the life of the Cuban Republic. The Constitution of 1940 was such an attempt. Don Cosme's efforts could have led to another attempt. The reason for the failure of those attempts, again, lie deep in the fabric of the Cuban meta-discourse, of the Cuban culture. Reconciliation is a process by its very definition should lead to conciliation, to the state of society where fundamental humility and intellectual humility come together to allow us to live in the justice of reciprocally recognized dignity and in the truth of dialogue. But that state, conciliation, does not have an absolute beginning, an absolute point of departure that lies outside itself. The future always begins in the present. There is no other way to conciliation, in that it does have a point of departure that lies outside itself. It arises from the situation of alienation and lack of peace, which needs to be transcended by the very process of reconciliation. To do that, we need to make a commitment to the recognition of dignity in the other. Other, not other here, other there. To do that, we need to make a commitment to the recognition of dignity in the other, not as an indication that we condone or approve of their behavior and actions, but as an indication that we recognize and acknowledge the dignity that accrues to them simply as human beings, as persons. We need to make a commitment to live in an attitude of dialogue as an indication that we realize that truth is procedural, not absolute, and that neither of us nor them possess it absolutely. Not as indication that we agree with their ideas or their principles. We don't. We must commit ourselves to the courage to be part of a process of which we know the beginning, but not the end. I'm coming to the end. And the discipline for the intellectual humility that will allow them to realize that patient and honest dialogue is the only way to live in conciliation, to live in democracy. Jose Marti, who all sides in Cuba, in Cuban civic and political life admire and claim as their own, is an example of the recognition of the dignity of the adversary, a dignity that requires us to do good to them regardless of how they treat us. In the middle of his struggle with Spain, whose authorities had committed him to prison and forced labor, and would cause his death a few years afterwards, he penned the following: Para Aragón en España, tengo yo en mi corazón un lugar, todo Aragón, franco, fiel, fiero y sin saña. This sentiment toward his enemies, which defines him as a noble and democratic person, he extended to all human beings and expressed it in a short poem, which in its simplicity and clarity unveils for us the best qualities of his identity and can be a model for every person, but very especially for us Cubans. Cultivo una rosa blanca en junio como en enero, para el amigo sincero que me da su mano franca, y para el cruel que me arranca el corazón con que vivo, cardos ni ortigas cultivo, cultivo una rosa blanca. Notice that Marti does not hide nor gloss over the fact that the actions of the other are cruel. He so declares unambiguously, as well as the fact that the other is his enemy and acts as such. Nevertheless, he answers, he returns his enemy's cruelty and the lethal harm that he causes him by growing and offering him a white rose, the same gift that he offers his friends. He recognizes the dignity of his enemy and repays his harm with good. Commitment to the dignity of the other, commitment to dialogue, requires from us humility. And that cannot be sold. That cannot be learned in academy, in the academy or in the schools. It's an existential reality, a living reality that we learn every day of our lives with a little bit of a touch of wisdom by accepting, I think, the great source, the great school for humility is the recognition and acceptance of our suffering. I don't know about you, I'm 71, and in those 71 years I have made many, many, many mistakes and have suffered many things of all kinds. When I look back to that, I realize that it's from the mistakes, from the error, from the suffering that I have slowly, hopefully grown to appreciate my humanity and my dignity. And it's the only thing I carry. Not academic titles, not positions, but that dignity. That dignity. It is only through life lived like that, slowly. I don't put myself as an example. I'm struggling like everybody else. This is not a lesson. It's a sharing with all of us Cubans to choose to have the discipline of humility, to choose dignity for us and for the other, to choose dialogue between ourselves on this side of the Strait of Florida and on the other side of the Strait of Florida. May we all follow Marti's example. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Fascinating. I think this really rounds up today's conference in a fantastic way. Thank you so much, Dr. Solis. It's a wonderful presentation. Now we go to lunch, again, across the street, and then we will back here by 1 o'clock, and we will hear from, I'm sorry? 1:30. From 1:30? At 1:30? Okay. I think we can probably, 1:30? 1:15, so that we can finish a little earlier. And I'd like to recognize Ambassador Pickering. It's right here. Thank you, Ambassador, for coming. Okay. The ambassador made a one-day trip just to be here with us. So really, thank you so much for doing this. We truly appreciate it, and we look forward to hearing from you right after lunch. Okay, thank you.